Good afternoon. My name is Helen Wong. I'm the director at the Washington State China Relations Council. Thank you for joining us for a panel discussion on anti-Asian hate crimes and violence. Today's event is part one of a series of 2 webinars, and it will focus on community experiences, concerns, and responses. Part 2 of the series, whose date is not fixed yet, will focus on government perspectives of this issue. So please stay tuned for the announcement regarding the second part of our series. First, just allow me to briefly introduce our organization, the Washington State China Relations Council. Founded in 1979, we are the oldest state-level organization promoting stronger commercial, trade, educational, and cultural ties between Washington State and China. This event is produced by our sister organization, the Washington State China Relations Fund, a charitable nonprofit organization founded in early 2020. Its main function is to support our educational programs and local community efforts. If you'd like to know more about our organization, to partner with us, or to support us, please visit our website at www.wscrc.org or contact us directly via email or over the phone. Some of you may remember that we had scheduled a webinar on this topic in April, to postpone at the last minute as it's conflicted with the announcement of the verdict in the George Floyd trial. That session was to feature government representatives to address responses to Asian hate crimes. We actually received significant feedback from the community, saying that we're missing half of the story by having only government representatives to address this topic. So we took the feedback seriously and realized that we should bring in members of the wider community and then make this a 2-part series. Therefore, today's event brings in representatives of the AAPI community in the Puget Sound region to share with us their stories and their reflections upon their experiences. On behalf of the council, I would like to thank the panelists for their time and effort, and I look forward to a very interesting and insightful discussion. To start, I will introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Our moderator today is Nelson John, a board member and longtime supporter of the council. Nelson is a partner at the Dorsey and Whitney law firm and the head of its national security group and a co-head of its Asia group. He also serves on the board of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in New York City and is an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu. Nelson is also an active member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Committee of 100. During the Carter administration, Nelson served as a White House fellow and an associate attorney general at the U.S. Department of Justice. He's been deeply involved in Asian American civic and civic rights activities and causes for over 50 years. Because of this involvement and his concerns and passions about these issues, Nelson has spent lots of time and energy working with us to make this event happen. So we greatly appreciate your support, Nelson. And now I'd like to turn over the program to you.
Thank you very much, Mon, for the kind introduction. And it's my honor to be the moderator for 4 outstanding panelists today, who I hope will lead us through a conversation about the anxieties and fears and hopes and expectations of the broader Asian American community across Puget Sound. We have several different perspectives represented on this panel today. I think it's fair to say I never expected in 2021 to find it necessary to have such a panel. Having been born in the year of the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, having witnessed the Civil Rights Revolution through the 1960s and 1970s, one had to assume that we were on a different trajectory in race relations in the United States. And it is certainly sobering for people of my generation to look around and see that we seem to have gone backwards rather than forward. But be that as it may, we need to confront these issues as they are today. And so we have a very lively and well-informed panel comprised of 4 leaders of the community. First among those is Laurie MATSUKAWA, an old friend, also one of the familiar faces to the Seattle area audience because for many years she was the main anchor at King 5 Television here in Seattle, and is a well-known journalist who has covered not only the community, but Asian American affairs, and been an advocate for the Japanese American community in this community for a long time. She's also been very active in national associations of Asian American journalists. Next, we have Dr. Connie So, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Washington, and who has been a historian of Asian American history in particularly the Northwest, and how these kinds of issues have cropped up in the past and remain part of our present. We also have on our panel today Commissioner Sam Cho, who is not only the only Asian American commissioner on the Port of Seattle, but he's also a very distinguished member of the State Commission on Asian American and Pacific American Affairs in Olympia. And so he has both the local perspective as well as the state perspective right now on reactions to these issues. And last but not least, we have Helen Wong, who is from the Chinatown Information and Services Center, which is one of the premier service agencies within the International District in Seattle, and has long been involved in community affairs on the ground, as it were, particularly relative to a recent coalition that has been formed among different agencies to increase the regularity and accuracy of reports of Asian American hate crimes and incidents involving hate against Asians to the authorities, so that we have an accurate accounting of these incidents and the government responses to them. And so Helen will talk to us later in this panel about her experience as part of that coalition and how that is responding to the community's needs at this point. So to open up, I would like a bit of housekeeping first. We are going to entertain questions from the audience at the end of the session, probably for the last 15 or 20 minutes if possible. We would like you to submit your questions through the chat function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And then Mon will collect those questions and we'll read them aloud to our panel when we get to that segment of our conversation. We're going to have each of the four speakers address a certain set of questions individually, and then we will have an internal conversation among the panel members, and then we'll open it up in the last segment, roughly the last third of this program, for audience questions and answers, and we'll take as many as you send in and as we have time to meet during this session. So please do go ahead and use the chat function for those. Let me begin with that historical framework that I referred to earlier by asking Connie to reflect a little bit. There was a recent NBC News article that cited one service agency that had counted incidents, and between March of 2020 and February of 2021, there had been about 4,000 cases of anti-Asian violence and crime reported around the country. Yet in this year, in March of 2021, that same agency collected over 6,600 cases. So we had, if you do the math, almost a 20-time increase in the incidence of this kind of hate and crime in that one period. Can you help us understand the historical context and where this hatred and violence comes from, Connie?
Okay, well, I see that question as a two-part one. I mean, and again, I have a public policy degree, so that's why it's hard for me not to think of it that way. And I'm sure Helen will address this a lot more. But increase in reporting does not necessarily mean there's a bigger increase overall in percentage. It just could be there's more publicity, and that's why more people are likely to talk about it. We know definitely that all of this is an underreporting anyways, but I'm going to leave that more to Helen to discuss a lot of those numbers and so forth. On a historical level, And I agree with you, Nelson, when you talked about how we all hope that we're in a positive trajectory, given that, we have Barack Obama elected, and given that Gary Locke was, ambassador and everything, they seem like things are going pretty positive. But on a historical note, what I would say is, actually, I don't think there's any time when xenophobia wasn't pretty widespread among a very significant population of the United States. Sometimes we're in a bubble, we'd hang around the people we hang around with, and the people we're hanging around with are a lot more open-minded. So we hope that things are much more positive. But if you look in the 19th century, and just going to the 19th century with the arrival of the Chinese to America, and this followed the Opium War, I think if you look at the way the Western textbooks have justified Opium War, it has a lot to do with anti-Chinese sentiment. I mean, from Encyclopedia Britannica in 1842, writing that if you look under the entry of China, and I actually did this, I was looking to see long ago, but it's also in many textbooks nowadays, that if you look under the entry for Chinese, they wrote that a Chinaman is sneaky, untrustworthy, and so forth. This is all under Encyclopedia Britannica at the time, and that nobody who's Chinese is suitable for office. The way they went ahead and said the Opium War is a war on free trade because Chinese people are too ethnocentric. And again, everyone, and I'm from Hong Kong, that's where I was born. Everyone knows that there's actually a war on drugs, but that's not the way it's done in the West. And then the whole thing about eating bats and everything else, what was said about rat-eating Chinese people, the way they call things, all these different disease after Asian people, the misnaming of it, and Taiwan flu and everything else, I think it's been there for a very long time, unfortunately. But when we started paying attention about it more, had to do with the case of Vincent Chin, and again, someone who is Chinese American who was killed because Detroit auto workers were fed up with the fact they're getting laid off because of the competitiveness of Japanese-made cars and so forth. And the killing of Vincent Chin by 3 people, 2 people primary, and they hired another person to help out. All the witnesses were not called forth. And again, the 2 white men who initiated it, never had to serve any time in jail, only paid $3,000 fine. What was so important about it was that it triggered everybody else to coming forward. We learned about the Chusolí crimes. We learned about all these other hate crimes. We learned about an international level. And up until then, they did not keep track of hate crimes at all against Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans. So many people thought that time, people coming together, maybe we'll talk about it more, we'll understand why it was wrong. Although after 3 trials, the 2 men, Ron Evans and Michael Nitz, were found not guilty all the time, pretty persistently, and never served any time in jail. We like to think that was it. But then in the late 80s, we ended up having the Stockton Schoolyard Massacre, when the person who did the shooting went ahead and targeted a school that's not predominantly Asian, but the only people he shot at, the 32 kids wounded, were all Southeast Asian. And the ones killed were all Southeast Asian. And that was not considered a hate crime. And then in the 90s, we had Tin Min Lee. When I was going to school in the East Coast, we had dot busting in Central Park, where they went after anybody who had a dot. And then we have all these Ocean Shores incidents in Washington State. And then we have the Atlanta Massacre. So I'm just saying that it's been going around for a long time. And the reason why we seem to have it more, ever since the Vincent Chin case, the US Commission on Civil Rights actually published a series of reasons for why it may be happening much more. They're warning about it too. And it kind of goes back to what you said initially. It's the competitiveness of a lot of Asian countries and the greater competitiveness of people of color in the United States. What the 1992 US Commission on Civil Rights, and again, this is kind of old, but it's still the same thing. They warned that as because of the civil rights movement, more neighborhoods became open. There's a lot of movement violence. The majority of people who are getting bullied, hurt, facing hate crimes right now are actually in the suburbs, in the rural regions. We just see the ones in the city because cities have cameras. There's a lot of deep-seated racial hatred by organized hate groups, and they've been growing. You can look at the statistics from the Anti-Defamation League. We have a lot of insensitive media coverage of ethnic racial groups. Anything that's a crime committed by BIPOC people are seen as, Muslim person did this, or it seems like Asian person did that. I always think about the Virginia Tech massacre and why it is that South Korea has to apologize for what somebody in America did. You don't see people when a white person commits a crime. You don't see Germany apologizing for German-American activities. You don't see the British having to do that. But yet people in South Korea felt compelled to have to apologize for what happened in Virginia Tech, even though the people mostly killed because they chose an engineering building, were actually Asian Americans as well. And so again, the insensitive media coverage, as if everything about China, Japan in particular, it's always about taking over other people, when all you ever hear are negative things about a lot of people of the East. And then the last one, of course, is just poor police response. The fact that people don't take down hate crimes. It's very hard to get a definition of what a hate crime means. And therefore, people feel like they can get away with it. And the reason I'm talking about that is about 2 decades ago, and it was, again, they did it again in 2010. It's been shown in many statistics that Asian Americans and Pacific Island Americans are the most likely to be bullied in many schools. In fact, the less diverse your school, this is according to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the less diverse your school, the more likely bullying happens, especially, they also point out, in the schools where it's predominantly white. But again, we don't hear about these things. We don't hear about the Asian Americans and Pacific Island Americans getting bullied and how that's been going on for quite a while. We think that it's something new that's happening when it's been something that I've been warned about back in 1992. So it feels like something new. And in that sense, it's good because that means a lot of people didn't really directly face it. But I know, and from the statistics I've seen, and from the stories I've heard from students, there is a lot of my students are worried about walking around the U District because they get yelled at so much. So many of my friends who work for Seattle Times, other places, have been yelled at the Ballard Parks, Golden Gate Park, Golden, whatever that thing is. I don't really go there very often. But anyway, they get yelled at quite often in these areas. People have been yelled at and spat at in many communities. Many of my friends who work in the Chinatown International District have talked about, of course, we've seen these videos. But unfortunately, I don't think it's anything new. It's just that right now, you had a president who tolerated that a lot more. And we have a lot of people who are also very depressed because of stay-at-home orders, the economy. And so I will say there's a lot of mental health issues that's occurring as well. It's all coming together. The triggering is the mental health issues, the bad media coverage, the bad police response. All of that is coming together so that you see a lot of hostilities emerging. And I also think, especially in light of what we hear from Breitbart and all these other news sources, so-called news sources, the resentment that emerged because Barack Obama was elected, because you do have some of the other people of color who are being competitive now. So I think that all of this has been happening a long time. I don't think there was actually a time when America didn't have a significant number of people who are xenophobic.
Thank you, Connie. Let me take one element of your response and talk about the strategic competition between the United States and other countries in Asia, primarily China, and turn to you, Sam. You're sitting at the Port Commission, and obviously your business there is about trade, and our largest trading partner in the Pacific Northwest is China, both for imports and exports. So do you agree that somehow this strategic competition that has emerged and that more and more federal officials are talking about in fairly negative terms, both on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch, contributes to the climate that stigmatizes Asians in the United States, as Connie has outlined, and helps to perpetuate that stereotype of Asian Americans?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's definitely true that the rivalry or so-called rivalry between the US and China adds fuel to the fire. But I also think that, it's kind of red herring. The reality is that, our two countries are very, very much integrated in our economic ties. The reality is that, a lot of Chinese Americans continue to have deep roots in mainland China. And although it's true that we have certain political issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan, that and certain human rights issues that we want to press China on, the fact is that I think it's more of a scapegoat or a tool that's being used by certain politicians to really just add fuel to the fire. And I think Connie is highlighted the fact that we had a president who basically used who created a trade war, who started blaming China for COVID-19, calling it the Kung flu and China virus, right? And so for me, it's a question of like, what's the, is it a chicken or egg? Is the trade war and COVID-19 the reason for all this anti-China, anti-Asian hate, or is it the other way around, where this has always existed? The hate towards Asian Americans, the racism that Connie pointed out has always existed in America, but these issues of trade wars and the COVID-19 is being used and leveraged by certain politicians to further inflame that hatred. And I think it's more the latter than the former, if I were to take a position on that. So I definitely think that there's a level of grandstanding and inflaming of sentiments that's going on right now. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case and that people are taking advantage of it, are there other voices in government that are trying to counter those forces and to negate that image that's been created of Asians in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. And for every, I feel like, Dr. So talked a lot about our history of anti-Asian sentiment, racist policies and events. But in the last several years, we've also seen a huge rise in AAPI leadership, elected officials across the country and even locally, right? And I know that in Seattle and in Washington, we have a strong history of AAPI representation from Gary Locke, who became the governor of our state in the 90s, right? Which is, if you think about it, an incredible feat. I mean, it's hard to think of having an AAPI governor today, let alone in 1996, I think it was when he first got elected. You have the history of activism in Seattle with the Gang of Four and Uncle Bob Santos. And so locally here, I do think that we have a strong history of AAPI representation. We've had a recent resurgence of a lot of AAPI electeds like myself and Joanne and many others. And so I think that, with what's going on today towards AAPI, anti-AAPI hate, or this movement that we're seeing, this racial reckoning that we're seeing, we're going to see another wave of AAPI leaders, not just in politics, but in every facet, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's media, in sports, in all forms of influence. And I also, I think as far as pushing back against this narrative, and I hope Dr. So agrees with me, but I think one of the biggest things that we can do to curb this hate is to just educate people. We do not do enough in this country to educate people on the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, the contributions that we've made throughout the history, from building the Transcontinental Railroad to the 442 Regiment in World War II, to all the other things that Asian Americans have contributed. And the fact is that we are perceived as perpetual foreigners because we are not educating everyday Americans on the history of Asian Americans in this country. And we do not do enough to educate people on the fact that Asian American history is American history. And so to answer your question beyond just leaders and public officials, I think ethnic studies, expanding and broadening our K-12 education to include AAPI history so that people understand what our contributions have been, would make a tremendous difference with my non-POC BIPOC friends.
Well, let me take it from there over to Helen here and bring her into this conversation. At the policy level, for many years, restrictive covenants and racially restrictive housing practices caused the segregation of most of the Asian American community into what we euphemistically call the International District today, which used to be Chinatown and then Japantown and then Manila Town, and now Little Saigon. But even without the racial restrictions, it has remained a very vibrant face of the Asian American community. It's a very visible central location for many, even in the suburbs, to come in, to shop, to dine, to congregate. Can you talk to us a little bit, Helen, about what it has felt like within the ID over these last several months and how the community itself has responded to this crisis?
So thank you very much for having this event today and inviting me to be part of the panel. I think it's so important to acknowledge that there's a wealth of knowledge around the table, right? Not just the panelists, but I see all the faces of those who are truly invested in transforming change, right, into our communities of what has historically been racist policies and exclusionary acts. A little bit about CISC, if you don't know, we have been around since 1972. And I think the important part of this is that we really began by a group of young students at the University of Washington who recognized that there were systemic barriers that our seniors faced in accessing services. And so they formulated, a little office area to support these seniors. And now we provide services for clients at each stage of life, from birth to over 100 years, in over 16 different languages and dialects, over 31 sites, serving over 10,000 clients a year. And going back to what Sam and Dr. Cho talked about, there's still that pervasive feeling that Asians experience about being a perpetual outsider, right? The perpetual foreigner. And obviously, no matter how long you have been here, there's that feeling of being othered. And with the rise in COVID-related racism, there is that greater awareness of that fact, but there's also a fear, a physical fear. And we've heard from community members about staying at home for long periods, even though they've been vaccinated, avoiding going out unnecessarily, people not feeling safe to walk on the street or take public transit. And we know that this is taking a mental and emotional toll on our communities. Right? And the sad part of it is that it's being normalized, right? Well, restricted movement and not being able to have full participation in our daily lives because of this. And I want to acknowledge the economic loss, right, for the local businesses in the international district. Some have had to close or reduce their hours out of safety concerns. And we know that we know firsthand that they have been targets of anti-Asian racism hate. But I do want to bring it back, bringing back about the history, right? And learning from our history that there are things that are happening, right? ID district, as you were saying, is the heart of our community and our identity. And so there has been collective efforts. An example is after the George Floyd murder, local artists came together to the international district, right? And were able to build billboards and artistry that supported both Black Lives Matter and against anti-Asian racism, to really show that solidarity that we need right now in this time in order to transform any systemic changes. We have a CID night watch that is run by volunteers to provide a presence to the community. We have mutual aid where volunteers are coming together to support meals for the unhoused, and just really stressing that these, we need more support and more resources in order to be able to sustain these kinds of efforts and to put more of a positive light rather than the media turning the stories into, as Dr. So was talking about, this myth of scarcity of resources or competition, to really looking at ways to come up with proactive community-based strategies that the community knows, can identify what they need in order to feel like a sense of belonging.
So part of your work at CISC has been to take part in this countywide coalition organized by King County against hate and bias. Can you talk to us a little bit about that effort and how you see that has either served or not served the APA community?
Yes, sure. When the pandemic first started, CISC was hearing, like I'm sure many of you, the Asian community being targeted because of their identity. Children were being harassed. When there was in-person school and online being Zoom bombed with racist slurs and rhetoric. And our elders, were being yelled at or physically assaulted on Metro, on the street. And what was alarming is that they didn't know, because they didn't have the language to understand why people were yelling or, assaulting them. And so we felt like we had to take a stand and to do something. And we formed the Anti-Bias, Anti-Hate program at CISC, and we joined the King County Coalition Against Hate and Bias as one of the community trusted organizations to take reports. So to date, CISC has collected 207 reports of hate and bias. And in comparison, the Seattle Police Department in 2020 collected 21 reports of non-criminal bias incidents against Asians. So we can see the difference if you have deep ties in the community, right? Our program goes beyond reporting too, because we recognize that these are traumatic experiences, right? That are faced not just by the individual, but by the families, right? And affected in the communities. So we provide culturally responsive information, support, resources to survivors, and we can provide follow-up to be able to assess their needs in their healing journey. We provided outreach in the community around anti-Asian racism, as Sam was talking about, the importance of bringing mainstream governmental institutions, schools, in building an awareness around anti-Asian racism. We produced videos in 6 different languages to promote this greater awareness and the benefits of reporting to strengthen communities. We're holding community events for families because they've shown concern and want to know how to deal with, if their children experience racism in schools. But on a policy level, I think all of us are invested, right? So we want to, I know that Lori had mentioned earlier, a lack of data, but we have the data. So how do we bring this community together of interested folks to share that data, to say that we know what is happening is local, where it's happening and who is it happening to. And really how to sort of join together in being able to address systemic racism and build cross-racial solidarity to make the changes that are necessary for now and in our future generations.
Thank you, Helen. Turning to you, Lori, statistically, it seems that most of the reported incidents around the country have often involved targeting of Asian women and Asian elderly. And whether you're talking about the shooting deaths in Atlanta, where 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women, you talk about the 2 women that were stabbed on the streets in San Francisco at a bus stop, or the absolutely brutal beating of those 2 Korean American women running a liquor store in Baltimore who were pummeled with a cinder block by a large man. Can you talk to us about that apparent targeting and how that comes across, within the APA community to the segment of women and the elderly?
I sure would. Thank you for the opportunity, Nelson. First, let's talk about the model minority myth that we are living under. It has been with us since, the 60s, when it came out in a New York Times Magazine article about how well certain Asians were doing, that they were so wealthy and so well educated. But the double-edged sword, the other side of that success myth, was that it also, it was not representative and it was not true. You can't talk about Asian Americans as one monolithic group. There are some Asian Americans who are well educated and wealthy, and then there's a vast number of Asian Americans who are barely making it financially. And then part of that myth was that they are quiet and they are hardworking, which leads to exploitation. People will target and attack old people, especially, and young and women, especially Asian women, because they're not going to complain about it. They're quiet, they're compliant, they're not going to raise a fuss. So this model minority myth has really worked against the Asian American community. And so that has led to the targeting of the most vulnerable in the Asian American community, women and the elderly, and children amazingly enough, children are very much targets of slurs and spitting and taunting and bullying. I was very interested in Helen's comment about we have data, now what do we do with it? I would highly encourage people who collect data and who are experiencing anti-Asian harassment to contact the media. Over the last 40 years, the Asian American Journalists Association nationwide has been working really hard to integrate the newsrooms so you don't get that insensitive, tone-deaf, unaware of the historic background of anti-Asian sentiment that were in past newsrooms that were primarily white male run newsrooms. Over the last 40 years, AAJA has been trying to recruit Asian American journalists to universities. We give them scholarships so they stay in the universities, and we have them mentored, and we have grown over the last 40 years an army, I'd like to say, of Asian American journalists who are working in some of the nation's largest and smallest media markets, including New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. A lot of the coverage you've seen in the last year is because of the advocacy of Asian American journalists in the newsrooms. People like Juju Chang will go up to her news director and say, we've got to do a special on this. We have to cover this. And so there's an advocacy within the newsroom. And then there's an education factor. AAJA will educate other journalists who are not people of color, who are not Asian American, about how to pronounce names. What is the history of this particular ethnic group in the United States? What are some of the physical characteristics, the cultural values of this group? And so we work as educators to not just our newsrooms, but to other journalists. And then the other thing that Asian American journalists do is then they educate the general public by publishing stories, broadcasting stories, and specials and documentaries. We serve as a way to educate the general viewers and use the data that people like Helen Wong and Stop AAPI Hate and other groups are collecting to say, see, this is happening now, it's happening in your neighborhood. And then AAJA has to take care of its own members, especially during that Atlanta spree. Many Asian American journalists who are covering the story for their local stations, for the national networks, were harassed. Well, first of all, many of them were harassed being at the scene and doing their jobs. And then they also felt vulnerable because they were reporting on the murders of Asian American women. And the journalists, especially those who were Asian American women, felt particularly vulnerable, upset, alarmed, depressed. AAJA quickly, within a day or two of the murders, held Zoom meetings with journalists all across the country, their membership, with psychologists who could talk them through what they were feeling and what they were experiencing so they could continue to go to work under these very stressful situations and continue to tell the story. Ultimately, the goal of journalists, I think, is to create that documentation of what is happening, putting down the truth as it is happening and unfolding before them for the future classrooms that Connie So is going to be teaching, to make today's events part of our history, our narrative, and that is so important to understanding where we go next and how we protect ourselves and how we truly become a country that is dedicated to liberty and justice for all.
Nelson, if I could just quickly chime in here and build upon one of Lori's points, is that we talked a little bit about data and how our community is not a monolith. But the bigger point and the need here, because you asked me the question about what can we be doing, is we need to disaggregate the data, right? So if you take a survey, whether it's when you take your SATs or whatever, you always see like, what ethnicity are you? And you check off the box Asian. But that doesn't actually tell you anything, right? From a data perspective. Lori's point here is that we are not a monolith. I'm Korean American, Connie So is from Hong Kong. We have Taiwan. We're not a monolith. And the problem with the model minority myth, coupled with this lack of disaggregated data, is that it feeds the narrative of the model minority. We need to be able to disaggregate the data based on those different ethnic groups, so we can actually know which communities are suffering the most. Because when you just have averages or means, the data is not accurate. You're just getting a mean. You're just getting the average income of our community. Where, as we all know, an average is the top and the lowest combined, right? And you get the average. If we really want to cater to our community that needs the most resources, has the most needs, we need to disaggregate that data so that we know, oh, clearly the Hmong community is suffering the most. If you look at FAFSA applications, I believe this is still the case, that even Asian Americans receive the most FAFSA student loan dollars in the country, right? You would never know that if you looked at the aggregated data. But if you look at the disaggregated data, it would be very obvious which communities within the AAPI community are suffering the most. And so I think on a federal level, state level, even on a local level, when we gather data, it needs to be disaggregated.
Okay. And Nelson, can I add something else to that? I can't help it. Now you're getting to data, so you got the academic me coming out. Actually, even the disaggregation, we actually need to know. A lot of times people use the figures about getting college degrees as a way to say that Asian Americans are doing well. I just want to add that Mongolians are the 3rd or 4th most likely to be educated, to have a BA and higher among the Asian Americans. Yet they're also the 4th most likely to be impoverished among the Asian American communities. And that's why the disaggregation is more than just Asian groups. It's where we got our degrees. The college education actually comes out of community colleges, out of Asia, out of other countries, more so than the United States. We just overly focus on a very narrow group of people that a lot of white journalists tend to know because they're their friends. They speak English fluently, and they go along with a certain master narrative about the American dream that we get that way too often. So I want to say more because I'm going to get me into a larger tangent, but definitely there's a lot more to be said, a lot more education that's needed when it comes to disaggregation, but even beyond the ethnicities, you have to break it down, but where things are happening. And of course, about the states and cities we're living at. The whole thing about us making more money, we live in the most expensive cities in America. And you should compare us, Asian Americans in Seattle to white people in Seattle, Asian Americans in San Francisco to white people in San Francisco, because for the last 4 decades, we make less if you just took it to where we actually live at. Not even factoring our amount of education and everything else. But I'm going to stop there before I talk too much about these things.
That's right. Laurie, I'm going to ask one more question before we throw it open to the audience. And that's really to talk from your perspective as a journalist. Has the current coverage in the media writ large on anti-Asian hate and crime satisfied you or disappointed you, given your long experience? Are we getting better at this?
I'd have to say generally, yes, we are much better at describing hate crimes against people of color, generally. Because we have more Black journalists, by the way, we have very good coverage of everything from George Floyd's murder to the demonstrations to the, all of the things related to George Floyd. We have a much more accurate, heartfelt, and truthful reportage because we have Black journalists. And the same thing with Asian American journalists. We have them out there and they're observing and they're reporting and they're tuned in. Some of them are bilingual, trilingual, so they provide us even more accurate access to what is going on so that we can digest it and come to our own conclusions as viewers and readers. So I'm generally pleased with what we've seen in the last year, but please note it's taken how many decades of work cultivating interest in this industry. I mean, frankly, many people in America don't choose to become journalists because they don't make a lot of money, really. Journalists don't, but they're, dedicated to telling the story, to documenting the experience so that future generations can learn from it, so that policymakers can learn from it. We don't want to see the internment of Japanese Americans happen to any other group, right? So we're going to report the heck out of it, right? And it's different reporting from what was reported back then. And so that the academicians can therefore teach it to the next generation. That's why it's important to have ethnic studies, to have Asian American studies in our colleges. And like Sam pointed out, as early as our elementary schools, which is slowly happening, but certainly not at the pace or the breadth that I'd like to see done.
Thanks, Laurie. Okay, Mon, I'm going to come back to you now, and you've been reading the questions and comments in the chat. Are we ready to open it up?
Yeah, we actually, we don't really have questions. Mostly, I would say, you know, comments and thoughts from our audience. So we have Frank, who mentioned two names or two people who contributed to the fight against Asian hate crimes. So when it's Renton City Council member Kim Khan, and also Tanya Wu, who actually a member of the organization who leads the CID Night Watch. So we thank you them for their contribution. And also Connie, you know, sent us a message about this documentary that was funded by King County. It's on the writing on the walls, and actually the organizers are the OCA Asian Pacific Advocates, Winlook Museum, and Northwest Asian Weekly. So it's going to be screening on July 10th at Rainier Arts Center from 1 to 2 p.m. So if you can make it, please do go watch this important documentary. And then, so Noor would like to, Noor says, like, you know, really like Laura's comments about the, you know, the journalists of reporting Asian contributions to the US economy, especially Asian immigrants. So that's what the media should focus on, or should focus more on. Now we have a question. And actually, this is a question. So a question from Gina: how individual Asian American do to change the image the media portrays Asian Americans? I guess this is a question to all the panelists.
Go, Laurie,
Sorry.
go.
This is a very important question, because it's not just Asian Americans who want to help in this effort. It is all Americans of conscience. When they see crimes happen, you know, harassment happening against Blacks, Asians, elderly, children, people want to do something positive. And everyone says, well, what can we do about all this hate? Okay, several things. One, increase reporting of incidents. It's still happening. Harassment is still happening. Even though you don't see it on TV today, it's still happening. My girlfriend Samantha just said she was in a hotel checking in, and some guy walks up to her and says, I hate you, you're so dirty, you, and she's Chinese American, you know, racial slur for a Chinese person. And you know, she's like shocked and hurt and surprised that he would just walk up to her and say this. And his wife comes up, oh, he has diabetes. You know, like that's an excuse for saying something like that. She goes, well, I have diabetes too, but I don't go up to him and say stuff like that, right? So it's still happening. So one, report it, okay? To either Helen or to Stop AAPI Hate, but report it. Let's get into that data mix. Two, educate yourself and your peers and train for this kind of thing to happen. If you're sitting on the metro and, you know, someone's getting harassed, train yourself to how to be a bystander, a helpful bystander to kind of intervene. And there are classes on that being offered by Hollaback. You may have heard of that organization. And I took their class and it's very good. It raises your awareness and makes you think about what you are going to do when that person attacks you or the person next to you. Third, put some work legislatively to put some teeth into these hate crime laws. I mean, the law that was recently signed by President Biden is a step forward, but make it hurt if you are doing a hate crime against any person of color or any group. Make it hurt. Make the you know, the punishment more severe if it's an assault. Another thing is to support education of ethnic minority history, of Asian American history in schools, in public schools, in kindergarten on up. You know, let's make it part of the curriculum and provide teachers the materials that they need to teach their kids. And then my favorite, support local media. You know, you need community newspapers, Northwest Asian Weekly, you need the International Examiner, you need, right, the South Emerald, the South City Emerald, South Seattle Emerald. You need community newspapers, you need the Seattle Times, you need local reporting of what's happening where you live so that you know what's happening and you know when you need to take action. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Helen, do you want to go next?
I think, so I was just so enthralled by what, Lori, you were saying. And I think, I think what we need to do is to continue to challenge the narrative, right? We need to challenge the narratives because we know that in media, in academia, in institutions, BIPOC communities have been underrepresented or unrepresented. And I'm so thrilled to hear about, this uprising and sort of coming together of a more political voice for the Asian community. I can see that happening with our youth, and I can see that happening in our, multi-generationally. But we need to really continue to challenge that narrative, right? Because that narrative is really suppressing and marginalizing our BIPOC communities and creating this this idea of competition when really, we need to look at where, how white supremacy is really holding on to perpetuating these kinds of attitudes that are really harming our communities, right? It's physically, emotionally, mentally harming our communities, and it's not going to, it's not going to be healthier if we don't, wield our political voice and increase our visibility and to share our stories and to share our experiences and come together in forums like this. I hope I answered that question. Good try.
Connie, your turn.
Of course, I agree with everything Helen and Lori said. Every time I think about narratives and people talking, I just always be very conscious of the fact that no one person can represent everyone. But at the same time, the people who speak should know what the limits of their own education is in talking about it. And sometimes knowing what it is that we don't know is probably more important than claiming that we know more than what we actually do. With that said, I always get concerned whenever I hear people talking about Asian Americans, model minority, and all these other things, and how we have to be careful about divide and conquer. That this Asian group is a model minority group. This other Asian group is not a model minority group. And the way a lot of the stories about like early Chinese, late Chinese, and just talking about, I'm not talking about Chinese, a group that's better covered than some of the other Asian groups, but still that's so inaccurate. And if you know that the Chinese story is so inaccurate, then you can bet that all the other Asians, the Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, all of their stories are also not being covered. And the reason I'm mentioning this, I always feel like we have a sense of duty as Asian Americans in the sense that Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders really don't get a lot of coverage. And I always feel like it's wrong for us to always claim Asian American, Asian Pacific American, if we're not actually talking about these other groups, that we should do what we can to advocate. And also note that it's not as if every Hmong has the same story, every Vietnamese has the same story. And of course, we have increasing numbers of Central Asians and Northern Asians and just so many other people. But at the same time, note that the 6 most established Asian American groups in this order of population, Chinese followed by Asian Indians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Japanese, do make up 85% of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander population. So yes, a lot of what happens to us will impact the others, but we're more established. A lot of times you're preaching to the choir when you're talking among us. And I always feel that there's a lot of the newer groups that are probably in communities where they have a lot less support, and they probably have a lot more economic difficulties that a lot of us, our communities, still go through it, but we went through it much more in the early days as we're establishing it. So it's educating not just ourselves, but educating ourselves how to be good ally, not just to the African American, Native American, and Latinx communities, but also to our own Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander American communities, and try to make sure that they're included too. What always bothers me is whenever I hear people saying, oh yeah, the Asian American model minorities, meaning the more established Asians versus the ones who are not, and just how that is essentialized. And again, you guys, between just for the Chinese, because we're 25% of the Asian American population, even among the Chinese, there's actually more laborers than there are professionals in the Chinese American population based upon those who answer the census, because we know the census undercounts the people who are poor. So I'm just saying that every time I think about what people can do in the narrative, I guess it goes back to education. And those of us who have the privilege of being interviewed because we have certain positions, whatever, make sure that we do what we can to also talk about the people who are not being so represented here. And of course, make sure we don't essentialize, don't fall into this divide and conquer that their story is not important, my story is more important, I have more people, et cetera, et cetera.
Sam, do you want to take a shot?
Yeah, I mean, I think the quick and dirty answer here is this is why representation matters and why we need our community in every facet of American society. You know, as a politician and a public official, you know, I'm in spaces that are traditionally not occupied by young AAPIs. And I even had a moment where someone said, "Oh, you're not a quiet Asian, are you?" And I was like, "Yeah, damn right, I'm not a quiet Asian. You better remember that." And so this is exactly why if you want to change the perception and narrative towards Asians, we need to break that ceiling and end up in every space possible and show, you know, what we're made of, how we contribute. And so that's the other side of educating America. I talked about K through 12 education, but we can't just talk about history here. We also need to create history going forward as well. And so I think more API leaders in media, in academia, in politics, in business will definitely contribute to changing the narrative and the perception of Asians going forward.
Can I expand on that? You know, I've been relatively quiet here, but as a father of two sons who are now in their 30s, I would like to put in a vote for giving our children freedom to select their own careers and their own goals in life, and not to pick for them things that we think are safe and lucrative as the only options for them. I think that ends up channeling, you know, especially if the parents are themselves heavily engaged in science and technology, you know, that it's sort of almost a de facto option to go then that direction for your children. But I think if we have Asian American film directors and Asian American poets and Asian American journalists and even Asian American lawyers from time to time, you know, when I entered the legal profession in 1974, there were about 12 of us in San Francisco and in the organized bar downtown. Today, there's probably, you know, close to 1,000. And that's a huge arc of shift in history in that time, but only because more parents felt comfortable letting their kids go ahead and do that. So I would say if I were to make a contribution, it would be in the longer term, you know, to let your children go explore more things. And that includes being policemen, being firemen, being firefighters, you know, being all the options of society being open, not just the high prestige, high income ones.
Can I add one more thing about education? I think it's really important and appropriate for organizations like WSCRC to educate new immigrants. As new immigrants from Asia come in, they are coming to a country that they may not know the history of. And so we should educate them about why we value all of these things like equal justice, and why we should be allies with other communities of color, because they don't know how our Black brothers and sisters worked so hard to overcome racism and in an unjust, you know, legal system. And they don't know our history, and they don't even know about Japanese American internment. They don't know a lot. So we should educate our new Americans, our new fellow Americans about the history, so that they don't misconstrue the issues. When issues that require solidarity come up, that they don't pick a side that is actually detrimental to, you know, furthering justice for people of color.
Very good point. Thank you for adding that, Lori. Mon, do we have any other questions left over in the tray?
We do. We have two more questions. One is, I think, the moderators can maybe provide short answers because some of the answers may be covered by your previous comments. Another one is a pretty touchy and sensitive one. I'm not sure if our moderators would, answer within 5 minutes or so. Maybe that could be a homework for all of us. So I'll go with the easy one. So what's the best way, relatively easier one, but equally important. So what's the best way to facilitate a conversation among our peers that are non-Asian? It's not comfortable to talk about it, so people never bring it up.
Sam, do you want to open up on that one?
Ladies first. Go ahead, Connie.
Oh, no, that's okay, Sam. I was talking a lot. Go ahead.
No, I think what I do is I make it personal, and I tell my story, and it tends to help because whoever, whether it's your coworker or a friend, they know you, right? And you guys are friends for a reason. And so to share your story and to share your experience is very different from a hypothetical situation that they may not, right? Oftentimes you put someone in an uncomfortable situation, you tell them a story, and you're like, oh, well, that doesn't really happen that often, right? Right? Or like they kind of dismiss it. But when you make it your own story, something that happened to you, I mean, when Connie mentioned the Virginia Tech shooting, I was a junior in high school, and then actually there was a repressed memory that kind of got triggered from that because the guy who went on that massacre shooting, his name was Sung Cho, and Cho is my last name, and his parents were dry cleaners and my parents were dry cleaners, and I distinctly remember in high school being blamed and targeted for that shooting, even though, yeah, we had the same last name, but I was unrelated. I was nowhere near related to that guy. But I do remember, I just, for some reason, I feel like I repressed this memory, but I think that came up when Connie mentioned it. But stories like that, right? Like if I was white and a white guy went to a movie theater and shot up a movie theater, I mean, would I be blamed for it? Of course not, right? And so it's stuff like that, right? When you share stories that are very personal to you, I feel like it has a different effect on your friends and your colleagues. So I encourage you, if you're AAPI and you want to educate your colleagues and friends, try and make it a personal story or something like that.
Connie, did you want to follow up?
I think what Sam said is really good. I actually get a lot of people, rather than coming up to me and demanding to find out answers about, explain why China did this, and how come Asians all hang out together and all these other things. I always think to myself is, other people don't seem very sensitive to me. I don't really see why I need to be very sensitive to them. The one I always get is, why do Asians always hang out together at Odegaard Library, for example? And I always say it's because white people like to hang out together, and that's why they had redlining and restrictive covenants. I kind of go with whoever's talking to me. If the person is being rude and demanding, I feel like a lot of times people demand a lot about people of color, about as if we know everything about our history just because we're people of color. But I also think that it makes me uncomfortable. So I want to see how they feel. And if they don't like what I'm saying, then they need to think about why it is they're addressing me that way. What gives them the right to address me that way and not ask more? And Sam was talking about triggering things. I thought about the Beijing Olympics, and I'm looking forward to what's going to happen with the Japanese Olympics, because I get asked so many questions about all these various Asian countries, people who don't know me, people who are undergrads, people who are graduate students, even though I'm a professor, much older than them, would just somehow feel like they have the right to demand it. Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm Asian? All these things kind of intersect together. So I think to myself is, they're putting you in the spot to make you uncomfortable. Of course I'm in UW, I'm a pretty protected area, but I will put them the same way and ask them why. When people ask me, what are you? Where are you from? Where are you really from? I'll tell them, I ask them, because I am from Hong Kong, right? But I want to know where they're from, where they're really from. And if it's just curiosity, I always ask, why aren't you curious about the person next to me on the other side, to the left and to the other one? Again, I'm sure you don't mean it in a kind of racist manner or anything, but it is kind of coming off that way to me, because I feel like I should not be the one to bear all that discomfort. And then we can probably have a conversation about it. I've learned over the years to do with a smile and try to be a little bit nicer, because we have a pretty passive aggressive Seattle. But anyway, so I could do that too. But I just want to point it out that I shouldn't have to be the only one bearing that for their sake. They should hear it from my perspective sometimes too.
Laurie, did you want to throw in something here?
No,
Helen?
I don't really want to. If there are other questions I'd entertain, I'd rather entertain another question.
Okay. All right. Do you want to go with the other question, Mon, and we'll call it a wrap for the day?
Sorry. So it's a touchy and insensitive question, but I think actually it's important because actually, yesterday when I sent out the announcement to some of the WeChat groups, and actually a friend sent me a similar question. So the question is from Willen. Can the media do more to present a more balanced coverage on perpetrators of assaults? People are believing that violence is being committed only by Blacks. It's a touchy topic, especially when Asians are drawing that conclusion. So this goes to all the panelists. We would like to comment on that one.
Someone did bring that up. I don't know what it was, but why are Black people attacking Asian people? Aren't you allies? And I think part of it, again, is that education piece. We have to educate each other as allies and people of color about where we came from. And maybe our fellow Americans just need to understand that we've had a rough road to hoe here in America over the years, and that we have similar challenges, and you might be falling into a trap, getting lies and misinformation. If you had gotten a more historic perspective, maybe you wouldn't act out that way. But I don't think, I don't think you should not cover something because of who the perpetrator is. I mean, journalists just have to kind of cover what happens and have the story work itself out.
Any others on the panel want to tackle that question?
I think the statistics show that most of the perpetrators are actually white. 70 to 90% are white. And again, I know about it because I watched and read the media that says it. Part of the problem is a lot of people, we were kind of joking about this before the panel began. A lot of people only have the memory of a TikTok video and that's it. People really are just not interested. You can find that information pretty accessibly. And when some of my friends in China, when they WeChat me and talk about how come Black people are doing this and that, then I go through the whole thing. Well, when they saw in New York, that person just killed his mom. He has mental health problems, but that's not everyone. I think the awful one that I first heard about all this was E.E. Lee, the Hmong woman who was killed by 11, and most of the guys were African-American in Milwaukee. And they're now reinvestigating as a hate crime and so forth. I told them that there's a lot of these things happening. It does have to do with model minority, has to do with a lot of things, but we don't want to over-exaggerate that it happens all the time, but we don't want to ignore it, that people do this to each other. What I also think about is after 9/11, there were actually a set of East Asians who, in a particular school in California, who picked on South Asians, and we're calling them ragheads and all these other things. So it's not as if some of the Asian Americans don't fall into that ourselves, right? Fortunately, it doesn't sound like we have as many of that because we hope that we be sensitive to each other. But I'm saying that, again, we've been picking on media a lot, so sorry, Lori, but anyway, media misinformation and just, I can't help but think about the tolerance we have in our schools about making fun of people's lunches, making fun of people's names, and making just fun of a lot of things. It's a certain tolerance that a lot of Asian Americans have come to believe that our feelings don't matter as much. White people's feelings matter more. It's okay to make fun of our countries, even though we may not have much to do with that country. And, just all the insensitivity. And it's going to take a long time to unravel all that because it's not any one thing. It's a lot of things. And that's why the attitudes are being seen right now, are so visible. That's why they come forth so quickly. And with all the mental health issues, yes, I understand it's a mental health problem that a lot of people have, and a lot of perpetrators have mental health issues, but you do wonder why the people who are ill are picking on the Asians and not picking on some of the whites, not picking on some of the Latinx and other people, that it must be something much more systemic that they come to believe about Asian people, Pacific Islanders, and a lot of people of color.
Sam, do you want to take one word on this?
I have no silver bullet for that question, but I will say that I think the problem goes beyond just media. We live in a society of Instagram videos, TikTok, Twitter, and the reality is that we have no control over what goes viral, right? And so when it comes to coverage of certain incidents, quite frankly, the anti-Asian hate that we've experienced in the last year and a half, 2 years during COVID didn't really get picked up by mainstream media until it went viral on social media, right? And so the question here again is like the chicken or egg, is like, is mainstream media being influenced by social media and what's viral because they want the views, they want the likes, they want the, you know, the engagement, or is it the other way around, right? Is mainstream media the one that helps social media? I don't know the answer to this, but I do know that given how quickly we are changing in the advent of technology, social media, and the internet, that this has become far more complicated as an issue, not just for race relations, but also in politics. I was just on a conversation with Denny Heck, our lieutenant governor, and I was asking him, you know, social media has become a double-edged sword in the sense that it creates a lot of transparency and accountability because you get access to these politicians in a way that you never did before. But in that same light, I'm seeing a lot more, you know, political points being scored via a tweet. A lot of polarization is due to the fact that people are on social media trying to cater to their base, saying things that are detrimental to relationships between politicians. Politicians saying things on Twitter that in the background they really don't care or they are not pushing, but they say it publicly just to score those points with their base. And so, you know, this is the question here of like balanced media is actually one that transcends this issue of AAPI hate. It's actually a societal issue that we really, I think, we are reckoning with now, especially with fake news, disinformation. I mean, it's just a phenomenon of the 21st century that we're struggling with, and I think this is one aspect of that.
Just real quick. I do agree with you, Sam, and I do think that we have to become a more discerning media consumer. Everyone has to become a more discerning media consumer. What is the source of this? What is the proof of this? Who said what? Why are they saying it? And just become a lot more analytical of what we consume.
Well, I wish this panel could continue to go on and on because we have had incredible panelists. I thank Laurie and Helen and Sam and Connie all for your contributions and your time to share with us today and with the Washington State China Relations Council. Nora and Man, I thank you very much for allowing me to be the moderator today and for dedicating your time to support this effort in public education and public service. And I'll turn it over to you. Thank you again.
So thank you, Nelson. I totally agree with you. And then thank you for moderating such a great session, and also great gratitude to all the panelists for such a informational, insightful, and candid discussion. So we have to end here, but then as I said early at the beginning, so do watch for our email announcement for the second part of this webinar series. If you want it to be added to our email list, please let us know so that you can, keep updates with our upcoming events. So Nora, do you want to say something as well?
Actually, no, I think it's we've gone over time, and it was a really robust discussion. I really thank the panelists and for everybody who's participated. It's been a really good discussion. And as Mon says, we'll look forward to part 2 of this and take what we heard today, and hopefully our next panelist will address some of the issues we heard. So
Can
thank
I
you,
add one closing note? I believe that Man and Nora are going to put the recording of this program up on the internet. And so if you have friends or colleagues that would like to see this program, you can point them there and look on the WSCRC website for a link to the recording so that you can share this experience with others. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nelson. We'll also email all of you the link of this recording. So have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
And stay safe.
Great.